We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community.
Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Brooklyn Listigan, and today we are joined by Dr. Marla Epp. Dr. Marla Epp is an associate professor of the French Department of Humanities at MacEwan. She has been at MacEwan since 2018. She holds a PhD in French literature from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in History and Literature from Columbia University, where she studied at their Reed Hall in Paris. Her current research studies the evolving ways in which contemporary and French Francophone literature and film incorporate historical events into their narrations, including insights from Christine Montalbetti's works. Well, thank you for being with us today. I'm excited to get to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
So I am very interested in your kind of work and how that all really started for you. Where did your research and your education and all that start?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I study French literature, especially from France. I am not French, but I took French classes in undergrad. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I might want to be a history major, but I just kept taking classes in French and really liking it and really enjoying it. And then when I finished my BA, like many, I think, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I could do a master's at the University of Alberta in French literature. And so I thought I would give that a go. I was kind of interested in teaching French, and it was a program where we were able to teach French as well. And so I was interested in the possibility of teaching French and just doing more French literature. So I did that program just to kind of see what would happen. And we had to do a master's thesis. And the two classes that I had enjoyed the most in undergrad were French women's writing and French writing about the Second World War. And so I talked to my master's advisor, Dr. Lynn Penrod, who was lovely, and we figured out a plan where I could combine those two interests. And I wrote my master's thesis on French women writers during the Nazi occupation of France. And specifically what I was really interested in was how they wrote about the time period that they were living in and how they tried to make a story out of what they were experiencing. And I was especially interested in how they tried to kind of write stories that had meaning and almost like an ending, like they almost wrote these sometimes sad, sometimes happy, but these endings to stories at a time when they were really living in something that they didn't know how it would end. They were experiencing this historical event and they didn't know what would happen next. But how they sort of used writing, I think, as a way to impose kind of a little bit of order on something that was very disruptive that was happening in their lives. And so I loved it. I thought that was so interesting. And it really got me started on my interest in history and literature and how the two work together.
I kind of saw a little bit, did you study in Paris?
Yeah, so I did that master's program at the University of Alberta, which was a wonderful experience. And then I decided that I wanted to spend more time in France. So I started looking around to try to find programs that would enable me to go to France and spend some time. And I found a program. It was the first year. It was Columbia University, which is based in New York. But they have a campus in Paris called Reed Hall, and it's this beautiful old house in Paris, and it has a courtyard that has lovely trees and bees and flowers. And so they have this campus in Paris, and they were starting a program called a Master's in History and Literature. And I thought, that sounds amazing. I want to go and do this because it's my two interests, plus it's in Paris. So I applied for the program, and I got in. So I went. It was a 1 year. It was September to August, and it was probably my most formative research experience because I was in Paris. I got to go to so many different talks, and I took courses at French universities. And so I really learned more about how they do research in French. And I continued working on French women writers during the Second World War. And especially I looked at this woman called Edith Thomas, and she wrote short stories that she published clandestinely during the Second World War because there was Nazi censorship over publishing. And so she wrote these short stories clandestinely. And so I was really interested in her work. And she had donated all of her papers to the National Archives. And so I was able to go into the National Archives and look at her notebooks and look at her letters and look at her first drafts and look at her diaries, which was so cool. And I found a short story that hadn't been published that she wrote about the liberation of Paris, which is the moment when Paris, which had been under Nazi occupation since 1940, was liberated in 1944. And so she wrote this short story about it, but it hadn't been published. But it started me off on this track of reading about the liberation of Paris. And so that was the master's thesis that I wrote for that. But it was so cool to be in Paris and to have that kind of immediate exposure to French research and to French archives. And I loved it. And that made me want to do a PhD, basically. I enjoyed it so much. And I thought, what can I do where I can keep doing this kind of work and keep having an opportunity where I can go back.
With your research now, how does that translate?
Great question. So things evolve, of course. I continue to be interested, like I say, in history and literature and how they work together. But in my dissertation work, what I was really interested in is the figure of the historical investigator. This is kind of an old-timey reference, but it's a little bit a la Dan Brown, kind of Da Vinci Code, where you have somebody who's a kind of writer and they put themselves into the novel. So half of the novel is them talking about their day-to-day lives. The novels I study are much less exciting than a Dan Brown, but the sort of day-to-day lives of them going to the archives and trying to write and trying to piece together history. And then half of it is the history that they're trying to piece together. So it's this kind of double narrative. So it's set in our kind of present day, but it's talking about the past. And so that's what I studied for my dissertation, which is how they put into the novel, build into the novel, the ways we maybe try to make sense of the past and how maybe the past might impact the present. So that was my dissertation research. And then out of that kind of grew my current research. So I'm still really interested in novels that have this kind of narrative writer figure that sort of explains their process to you as they're going along. So there's this kind of, you almost have a kind of guide who's describing what they're doing. And they're talking about their life. And some of it's really mundane. Research is honestly kind of boring a lot of the time. And some of these sections are sort of boring where they're just like, and then I drank some tea, and then I turned on my laptop, and then I went to the archives, and it was a bad day at the archives. But it's sort of interesting because that is part of it too. So for a research podcast, if I really think about it, a lot of the books I'm interested in studying are books about research in a way, and specifically about research into the past.
So how do like contemporary writers shape cultural memory through their representation of historical events?
Yeah, thank you for that. That, again, such a good question. And I think for me, what it is really putting the process into focus, right? So often if we get, say, a historical fiction novel and it's just completely set in the past, that can be fascinating. And I love that kind of book too. But what I think the novels that I study are really interesting for is that they, like I say, kind of pull back the curtain, if you would. They sort of show the work that goes into doing historical research and the work that goes into like putting a story together. And so they question, right, if you read something and they say the green car went down the road, but it's from a black and white photo. How do you know for sure that the car is green? And then you can say, okay, that's a minor detail. But then the question is, if that's a minor detail, how do we know some of the other details that we include? And sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it does have kind of importance for what aspect of a story we pay attention to, for example. So that's what I really like, is how they sort of show maybe the seams, if you would, of how we build stories about the past, right? So none of these books are saying, let's imagine a different past. Like, they're all working from archives. And even though they're called novels, a lot of the books I study are really grounded in a lot of historical research. So they're not proposing alternative histories, or they're not even questioning anything about the importance of the archives. They're just sort of showing the process that goes into it and the way the stories we talk about history are always based on choices that the person that's telling them makes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's more of like a personal kind of way of telling the story rather than the whole grand scheme of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a personal way of telling a story. And often they focus on smaller kind of bits of a bigger history or smaller individuals. Or maybe there's a series of novels in French, a kind of trend called Tiny Lives. Tiny Lives. Les vies minuscules.
Way nicer. Tiny
Lives.
lives.
I was trying to think of how to translate it. It's probably not the best way to translate it, but smaller lives and why they're important to talk about as well.
So these novels, is there any bit of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So they all call themselves novel, and this is a whole question in literary studies. How do we define the novel? And ultimately, in a way, the novel's almost what you want it to be. They say it's a really capacious genre. Like you can sort of make anything a novel. And so for most of these books, they are all called novels, the works I study. But most of them are really grounded in historical research. But they also have this sort of auto-fictional aspect where they have this first-person narrator who's talking about their life. And we don't know how much of that is fictionalized and how much of that is real. They say it's them. They'll use their first name, for example. Like they'll identify themselves as this narrator. But of course, that's going to be sort of modified for the text. It's not 100% their lives. And then they say that a lot of the time the novel element resides in how they put these pieces together. And so it's the sort of writerly work that goes into building the novel that makes it into a novel as opposed to a historical text, for example, right?
So is the author, they're writing about themselves?
Yeah, so they're often in first person. And so, of course, in literary studies, we make a distinction between the narrator and the author. So the author is the one whose name is on the cover of the book, who does all the press. And then the narrator is going to be, in these cases, because they're in the first person, it's going to be the I that's talking in the book. And so for sort of autofiction, it has to be clear that the I is the author. But it's not exactly the author. The I is a version of the author, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
it does make sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of
weird to think about.
It's kind of weird to think about, yeah.
Yeah. But so they would say that it's not a one-to-one necessarily from the author to the narrator, but it is largely inspired by.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Really cool. Makes me want to write a book.
That'd be wonderful. I think you should.
About my current 2024 historical.
Yeah. No, you totally should. And I think that maybe it's just me, but I really like the more banal moments. Actually, I find them really interesting. I love a behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So you could write a compendium to these podcasts, a behind the scenes account of the podcast.
That would be pretty funny.
Yeah.
They would see a different side of me for sure.
Yeah, but I think people would like it.
Yeah. Kind of moving a little bit forward.
Yeah.
We were practicing this name before we started recording.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what drew you to Montalbetti's?
Yeah.
Perfect. Montalbetti's work.
Yeah. So recently, I think you might have probably mentioned this, I've been working on a French author called Christine Montalbetti. And she is studied by scholars, but she's not hugely well known, but she's quite well known. I would say she's in a very sweet spot of writing really interesting texts and being studied, but not being studied by everybody, which I really like. So there's lots and lots to say about her. And I actually discovered her at a conference that I went to virtually during COVID. And my dissertation advisor when I did my PhD, Gerald Prince, is really well known in the field, and he's been advising people for years and years and years and years. And one of his first dissertation students is a professor called Dr. Warren Mott. And he is at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he works on contemporary French literature. And he has excellent taste in books. So if he starts working on a novelist, you know that there's something really interesting about that novelist. And so I really like his work. And he presented on this book called Mon ancêtre poisson, my ancestor, the fish. The play on words doesn't work really well in English because poisson in French is fish, of course. And the narrator, which is a form of Christine Montalbetti, the author, in this book does all this research on her great, I think, grandfather, Jules Poisson, who was somebody who worked on botany. He worked at the Natural Science Museum in Paris in the 19th century. And he wrote articles that were published in nature journals and stuff. So his last name is Fish, Jules Fish. But of course, with the play on words in the title, she's also referring to the fact that evolutionarily humans are evolved from fishes. So it works better in French, mon ancêtre poisson, as opposed to, so it has a capital P on it. Mon ancêtre poisson, as opposed to my ancestor
Is a fish.
My ancestor is a fish. Actually, you know what? That's good. My ancestor is a fish works better.
Oh, because it makes sense.
Because it makes sense. Because then you put a capital F on fish. That's actually really good. If I ever translate the book,
Yeah.
I'll credit you.
Okay, thank you.
Anyways, sorry, I lost my train of thought talking about the translation. Oh, how did I get into this book? So this professor gave a really wonderful presentation on this book. And I thought this book is fascinating. I need to read it. So I read it and I realized that there was more to be said about it and that I wanted to say it. And so I started working on it. And what's quite interesting about this book is it's, like I say, a version of Christine Montalbetti, who does all this archival research on her ancestor, Jules Poisson. And in Paris, he worked at the Natural History Museum. And it's still there. And the Natural History Museum is in this area. It's a garden. It's the sort of natural history compound in Paris. So there's this garden called the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. And around it is the museum with the paleontology and all the dinosaur bones. And then there's the museum with the taxidermy animals. But it's also where the researchers work and where they have some of their samples, I guess. I'm not a biologist. They're various samples. And you can still walk in the paths of this park. And so she would go and walk in the paths of this park and imagine her great-great-great-great-grandfather walking in the paths of this park. And she has this style where she looks in really close detail at all the things around her. So she would describe the park and the trees and the leaves and the flowers and the insects and all the different animals. And she would talk about the physiological process of breathing. And so she would imagine the air coming in and then going into like the lungs and then the bronchioles and then coming back out. And then she would imagine her great-great-great-grandfather breathing in the same air and the fact that sort of there's this really deep connection amongst living beings that we don't always pay attention to. But if you really think about it in the park, right, you're in this kind of process of exchange with other living creatures. And so she was talking about the past and about the archives, but ultimately one of the ways that she was able to connect with him was less through reading his work, although that was certainly one of the ways she connected with him. But another way she connected with him was by sort of imagining the spaces that he was in and the kind of trees he might have seen and the animals he might have seen and the insects and how he might have experienced winter or the changing of the seasons. And so she was kind of thinking about physiologically how we exist as bodies in space. And that can be another way to sort of feel close to somebody. So that's what I found really interesting in that text.
And then you also did some research on another one of her texts. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So this, you'll sort of see now we started with women in history, still interested in how we talk about history, but this time I went much more to the present day. And this novel is called La vie est faite de ces toutes petites choses. So life is made of all these small, or to use my favorite word, all these tiny things. And it's about the Atlantis space shuttle launch, which was the last NASA mission to the space station flown using a certain kind of space shuttle. Don't quote me on this. But it was the mission STS-135. And so Christine Montalbetti got access to all of the NASA archives. They gave her all of the archives because she was going to write about this experience. And what again, I really find interesting in these texts is the sort of way they show the joins of a narrative, right? So instead of just being a kind of narrative about the space station, and we can all kind of imagine those movies, right? We've seen like movies in space. So instead of sort of having the grandiose music and just having the launch and being really heroic and stuff, she went and described everything in really minute detail. Again, that's kind of her thing. And she put herself again into the novel. So she talked about how she made the decisions that she made, and she imagined what it might have been like. But each time she imagined what it might have been like, say, to take a shower on the space station, she'd be like, this is me. I'm telling you about this. So sort of remind you. So she never got into the head of the characters. It was always sort of her perspective and her choices and which details she was going to tell you. And so you got all this detail about the space station, and she said it was all based on archives. But she also kept reminding you throughout that she was the one telling you this story, and that she's a French woman writing in France telling you about Cape Canaveral in Florida and be like, this is what I'm noticing. This is what I see. This is what we could see. And this is what the spectators are seeing. And so she sort of tells you about how we build these narratives. And what I found really interesting about this is because she has this really close attention to detail, it kind of changes what we focus on. So she's telling this story. We can all kind of imagine it. We've seen the movies and stuff. And she's in awe of how we're able to go to space. Of course, she's like, these astronauts are amazing. It's so cool. But she'll go into all this detail. So she'll tell you how to shower in the space station in all this detail. And then she'll sort of change her pronouns. So she'll start saying like, okay, the astronauts are going to go have a shower. This is how they do it. And then she'll be like, you take the soap and you do this. So it's almost as if the reader is invited to participate in this event.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
But then she will also use the same level of detail on Earth. So she'll be like, imagine taking a shower on Earth, how the water runs down and how it looks against the tiles of the shower, and how, you know, you have the shampoo and you have the shower gel and how the water sinks down. And she's like, and we never talk about this enough and we never celebrate this enough. And so part of her thing is to say, if we're going to apply all this detail to space, why don't we apply it to Earth and be as amazed by all the stuff on Earth as in space? And so she also talks about all the animals, which I'm also really interested in. So she gives all this detail about the space launch, and she imagines all the people at Cape Canaveral waiting for the rocket to launch. But in this space in Florida, there's all these animals too, right? There's dolphins and trout and manatees and pelicans and seagulls. And so she describes all of these that we don't really think about usually when you think about a space launch. And she's like, why don't we pay attention to them too? Because think about all of these other things and all these other creatures that are around us.
That are also watching.
Exactly, that are also watching.
Yeah.
And then she has this cool line where she talks about the dolphins. And she's like, well, waiting for something to happen, the people are watching the dolphins. But her point is kind of like something is happening. Dolphins are there. And how exciting is that? And how wonderful and how marvelous. So her whole sort of novel is about changing our focus and thinking about how there's so many different creatures that are around us again, and thinking about how we breathe in the air and all of the living creatures that are around us in the world.
I love that. I think about that lots, even like walking downtown or whatever, just noticing things.
Exactly.
It makes you feel way better.
It really does. I don't know if you've ever gone for a walk recently with a dog. I go for walks sometimes with my parents' dog, and it's really changed how I look at the world. And also reading Christine Montalbetti sort of in conjunction, it makes me think of her when I'm walking my dog, because she will just sit for hours if she could. She can't, but she would, and stare at a squirrel. Yeah. And she's just fascinated. And now when I'm walking, even without the dog, I notice the squirrels. And it's so cool that we have squirrels in our city. But how often do we just sort of ignore them? So I think, like training our eye to notice different things.
Yeah. Well, especially like I don't have a dog here anymore, but my family dog, she's a lab. So she notices everything.
Yeah, of course.
And I think we're so quick with animals to be like, no, like come here. We're not looking at everything. But if you just follow them, they find some really cool things.
No, exactly. So I guess Christine Montalbetti actually has a really cool text about dogs. And she visited the professor, Dr. Warren Motti, whose novel, no, sorry, I lost my train of thought again.
That's okay.
She, Christine Montalbetti, has very cool texts about dogs, and she visited the professor whose paper inspired me to start working on Christine Montalbetti in Colorado, and she put his dogs in her recent novel.
Oh,
So to kind of go full circle.
little shout out to the dogs.
Yeah, a little shout out to the dogs.
Okay, I think we are almost out of time
All
here.
right.
But one last question,
Sure.
which is the hard question. Do you have any advice for any listeners, researchers, students, faculty, any advice? Doesn't have to be based off of your research or your expertise. Any advice at all?
That is such an open-ended question. It's wonderful. Any advice at all? Oh my goodness. I mean, my students who I'm going to go teach very shortly will probably know this, but read, I think. Just
Yep.
read as much as possible. And I think, and I'm going to sound old, but I think with phones and screens and stuff, it's so easy to not read. And it's so easy to read your phone or to read on the screen. And I think taking a paper book and reading a paper book is so important. Because I think we read differently on a screen. At least I read differently on a screen. I'll absorb the news like anybody else, or even I'll read PDFs. And I think I kind of skim. In French, they have an expression called lire à diagonale, like read diagonally. And I really think I bring that when I read online. And I think really taking the time to get into a book, whatever it is, fantasy, romance, in the language you speak most frequently, in a different language, whatever it is, I think is so wonderful. And I do think literature helps us understand the world in different ways. Like I say, one of the things I like the most about the novels I study is how they describe their process of trying to make sense of the world. And I think novels are one of the really important tools that help us think about the world in different ways and learn new things and think about different people and get different perspectives on things and learn about history and learn about space and learn about Jules Poisson and all the different things in the world. So I think just to read whatever you like to read, treat yourself, is so important. And it's a skill like any other. And I think we have a tendency to get out of practice with it because you can't really look at your phone at the same time. You can't really multitask when you're reading. And I think
That's the joy of it.
it's the joy of it. Yeah, is to just even give yourself 10 minutes to just read a book and really pay attention to the words, right? Writers these days put so much thought these days, all days, readers everywhere. And oh my gosh, I've lost my train of thought again. Writers, not readers, writers put so much attention into the words they choose. And in this time, I'm going to sound like a kind of a crank, but in this time of AI, I think it's really important to look at writers and the words they choose and why that's so important and what they use these words to tell us about the world. And it's sort of something from them that's very personal, which is another thing I like about my books. It's something very personal. You see how personal it is. So you get those personal words and you can read them personally. So I don't know. I think reading is just so important and we don't do it enough. And I certainly don't do it enough. But that would be my advice. Read whatever you're interested in. Find something that you like and read it.
All right. Well, I will read now. Well, thank you for being here with us today. It was wonderful to get to talk to you and get to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Thanks. Wow, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can follow us on your favorite podcast platforms to find new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can leave us a like, give us a follow, or send us a message if you have any follow-up questions from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization Podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.